So I'm going to start out today by talking about two artworks from the exhibition, one by Rengetsu and one by Nantenbō. And I'm going to dig into the contents of each of those artworks as we see them and ask some questions of those works. Then I'm going to take a step back from those two works and try to think about the functions and materiality of some of the works that are on display in the exhibition, and in a way to ask what the underlying technologies for the presentation of these artworks does that is special or meaningful. Then I'm going to return to those two artworks that I started out with and look at them in a new way. That's the plan. These are the two works I want to start out with. On the left, we have a poem by Rengetsu. It's on a very traditional rectangular kind of card called a shikishi that has been mounted as a hanging scroll. And on the right, we have a kind of colophon, a text at the top, and a very sketchy representation of Mount Fuji, also mounted as a hanging scroll by Nantenbō. So let's begin with the work by Rengetsu. This is in many ways similar to lots of other Rengetsu works on display here in this exhibition, as well as other works of hers that you can find in collections across this country and throughout the world, especially in this Rengetsu moment that we're currently in, as Peter's been talking about, that there seem to be these wonderful exhibitions and conferences related to Rengetsu happening all over. To take a closer look, this is a poem, Walking Along Akashi Bay. I'll go into the details of the poem a bit more in just a moment. But I just want to call your attention to the kind of layers of presentation here. So we have the poem, which is a waka poem, authored by the nun Ōtagaki Rengetsu, which is brushed in her distinctive calligraphy by her own hand on this shikishi rectangular card or kind of specialized piece of paper, which is then mounted and preserved on the hanging scroll. So I'll come back to that later. We ended up defaulting to the website rengetsu.org, which is a project of various scholars to present and translate all of Rengetsu's poems and give a mini biography of her and her work for our translations. So there are many ways to translate these poems, but the translation I'm relying on here is just the one from that website. So I just wanted to make that clear. So the poem reads, Koto no Hano. And I'll just say from the very beginning that one of the interesting things about, Rengetsu's calligraphy, and this is true of many calligraphers in pre-modern Japan, is that she varies the kana. She varies the characters that she's using. So even in this one line, Koto no Hano, we have the typical hiragana no that students of Japanese would be familiar with today, with the kind of hentaigana version, a different version of the exact same character. And she does this all the time in her calligraphy and in her pottery. So this is Tama Hiro Wabaya Aki no Yo no. This is that same no you can see there, and this is the same no as there. Suki ni Akashi no. Here we have a third way of writing the character no for no particular reason, other than the variety and eclectic quality, or maybe there are particular reasons. Paul can tell us later. I already read this one. So let's see, it's ura zurai shite. So she had to, when she got to the fifth syllable in the 7 syllables of this line, she'd run out of paper. And this happens a lot. So she shifts over to the left and writes shite, the very ending of the poem, a little bit off course. And you see this especially on the pottery, where she is even less conventional in her formatting and inscribing of the characters onto the clay, the haptic qualities of handling the vessel that Melissa talked about this morning, and needing to turn the pot in order to read the poem, needing to have this kind of embodied relationship with the text because it's on a three-dimensional object, to a certain extent is also clear here in this poem. Now, this poem is, on its surface, incredibly conventional. Walking along Akashi Bay this moonlit evening, searching for fitting words to tell of this beauty. This translation leaves the seasonal word, autumn, out completely, but Akashi Bay is a really important site in Japanese culture and poetry, Tsuki ni Akashi no. It is located here between the coast and Awaji, and it's a site that is mentioned in pre-modern Japanese poetry, in the tale of Genji, in which it plays a really important role. Genji the Shining Prince, when he's exiled, spends time in this region, and as he does every moment of his life, falls in love with a lady of Akashi and cheats on his wife with her and feels guilty about it. So Akashi is a term that comes up a lot in the canon of Japanese poetry. It must have been a beautiful pastoral place. This is, of course, a romanticized representation from the Tokugawa period in a woodblock print, but the beaches today they don't look like they once must have, to say the least. The coast around Kobe is highly modernized and industrialized. But I love the way that Akashi here also, can be read as a kakekotoba, a pivot word, because Akashi also refers to the light that appears just before the dawn. So this is a poem about walking under the light of the moon, but it's also about looking forward to the light of a new day. So there are unquestionably very strong themes, as Melissa explained in her lecture, of Buddhist impermanence, the ephemerality of life, but also the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. There's many different ways that we can read this poem intertextually, and that's part of what makes translating a waka poem into English almost an impossibility, because every word potentially is a reference to a line of poetry from the past or from her network of friends. It could be a reference to her own biography, to the people in her life who are important to her. In some ways, the point that I want to make about this text, which is, again, almost selected at random from among her many poems and many beautiful works of calligraphy, is that this is densely intertextual and, I would argue, a social document. It is connected to a network of relations that are invisible to us. We see the beautiful form of her handwriting that Paul talked about so elegantly early today, and we can do a kind of literary or poetic analysis of the words. But the people behind those words are largely invisible to us. And that's very characteristic of a lot of works of calligraphy. Let's turn now to this work by Nantenbō. This is a very different kind of work of calligraphy. It has a representation of Mount Fuji and this inscription on the top, "Tall and steep, Mount Fuji towers forever." There is a long tradition of images of Mount Fuji in Japanese culture. I'll show you some examples from the Zen painting tradition, the Zenga tradition, in a few minutes. And the image of Fuji is popular for many reasons. It's of course a beautiful volcanic cone that you can see when traveling between Kyoto and Edo along the traditional highway, the Tokaido. It is associated with immortality. The word Fuji is a homophone for a word that means immortality. In the Zen tradition, it sometimes is imagined to be a kind of representation of a human body seated in meditation. eternal and strong, but also seething and ready to blow, right? And there's a whole popular religious tradition that developed during the Tokugawa period of climbing the mountain, searching for the Buddhist paradise on its summit, and also trying to avoid the cave to hell that everyone knew existed at its base. So Mount Fuji is ripe with various meanings. But the particular inscription on this work of calligraphy introduces us to a different aspect of Mount Fuji's heritage. So tall and steep, Mount Fuji towers forever. The rays of the rising sun illuminate the islands of Japan. There's no need to describe the beauty of the distinctive scenery of this land, this enchanting land of spirits from which a talented people are born. This is Japan, the land of the gods. Now, this text was originally authored by a member of the Japanese military, Count Nogi Maresuke, who is a really important figure in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. He was one of the commanders who successfully seized Port Arthur from China during the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. He became the Governor General of Taiwan after Taiwan was annexed as a colony of Japan. He was also a leader in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. And he was a fierce nationalist and imperialist. And he also was a dedicated student of Zen Buddhism who studied with Nantenbō. They had a strong mutual respect. And as Paul mentioned earlier, Count Nogi is infamous in Japanese history because when the first modern emperor, Emperor Meiji, died, Count Nogi and his wife committed suicide to die with their lord, this traditional practice of junshi, which of course was seen as a kind of barbaric feudal relic of an earlier age by the majority of Japanese people in the early 20th century, but which was seen as a traditional ritual, apparently, to the general and his closest peers. What's interesting is to try to place this image and this calligraphy in context. So, as I mentioned, there's a kind of genealogy of the representation of Mount Fuji that we can look to. This is a zenga, a Zen painting by a Zen monk named Sengai Gibbon, who was originally from a peasant family and went out on a pilgrimage as a young man and ended up becoming an ordained Zen monk. He ended up living in Kyushu for some time, later became the abbot of the important temple Shofukuji, and he spent his retirement painting and doing calligraphy. And he was a kind of ornery character. Supposedly, his last words before he died were, "I don't want to die," which strikes me as a not particularly Buddhist, but a wonderful human expression of the fear of what comes next. This puts Nantenbō's Fuji next to Sengai's Mount Fuji. Here's another interesting example, Sun Rising Over Fuji by Daikaku Seppo. This was brushed by a really interesting and eclectic Zen monk who was abbot of the temple Ryugein, which was located near Mount Fuji, but he was expelled because of his criticism of the Zen institution. And he then traveled the country proclaiming himself to be the defrocked monk, Daikaku. And he had so many supporters that he was appointed to be the abbot of a different Zen temple in the Tohoku region. And he had a very performative, brusque style of teaching. And he was known for his so-called crazed style works of calligraphy and painting. So almost certainly an influence on Nantenbō. This last image I wanted to show, what's interesting about this piece is simply that it is a representation of Mount Fuji completed in just 8 brush strokes by the Soto Zen monk Toshu Emyo. This is from the 19th century. We don't know as much about this particular monk painter, only that he was active in the 19th century, and he served briefly as the abbot of a temple in Niigata Prefecture. So there's a longer genealogy that I want to mention very briefly that I think in some ways is even more illuminating. And this is a painting with, as you can see, a major colophon inscription attributed to the Zen monk Kenko Shokei from the Muromachi period, the 15th century. And this is a painting of Mount Fuji that is noted for its very kind of lifelike representation of the hills that can only be seen from one direction when you're looking at the volcanic cone of Fuji itself. Sometimes representations of Mount Fuji seem to exist outside of space and time, and you have no idea where the viewer is looking from, whereas this one is grounded in a particular place. But what interests me about this particular image is the fact that the text reveals that this painting was made to be given to a member of the Ashikaga military government. And it represents the close relationship between Kenko Shokei as a Zen monk and the military leadership of his day, and I think is a useful piece of evidence and a reminder that the close association of religious leaders to military rulers is by no means a modern invention or a new phenomenon in the Meiji period, but is embedded in Japanese history, and the close collaboration, in fact, between Buddhist institutions, and in particular, in the medieval period, Zen institutions and samurai authorities is an important part of Japanese history. And Nantenbō is part of that, as my title to today's talk alludes, community of practice, a kind of vertical community of practice that extends backwards through time as much as he is his community of peers and friends and supporters in the early 20th century. Just a close-up of this representation of Fuji. This is a kind of traditional way of showing the mountain to have these 3 subdivisions to the peak, and then comparing it to Nantenbō's more hastily brushed representation. So, okay, that's my initial attempt to look at these 2 objects in terms of their contents. Now I want to take a step back and think about the forms of some of the works that are in this exhibition. And I want to begin with a form that we've heard a bit about already, the poem slip, or the tanzaku. So we see poem slips represented in this exhibition in many of the works by Rengetsu. And Rengetsu seems to have produced voluminous quantities of tanzaku, as Paul talked about earlier, and these may even have been collected together into volumes during her lifetime. The form of the poem slip, I think, is really interesting and revealing, because what's so special about this long rectangular shape is that it is portable, and it fits in your hand, and it can be passed from person to person in everyday social interactions. So this alludes to the fact that poetry, both the tradition of waka poetry in which Rengetsu is situating herself, but also the early modern poetic tradition that became incredibly important and influential in the era in which Rengetsu lived, which is the haikai or haiku poetic tradition. These were fundamentally social practices in which poems were often created as a kind of gift through a social exchange. So perhaps the most famous example of this is the travels of the haikai poet Matsuo Basho, who would travel around Japan and write both prose and poetic records of his travels, but also his encounters, and would write poems on the spot and gift them to his hosts or his friends or people he encountered, and sometimes receive poems in exchange. So the tanzaku is a kind of material representation of those encounters. But tanzaku also have another function, which is they can be used to represent utterances at social gatherings, like the wonderful seasonal gatherings that happen in the spring to celebrate the cherry blossoms, and that happen in the fall to celebrate the lovely autumnal foliage as represented in this 17th century painting, which actually is paired with another set that shows the cherry blossom trees with tanzaku hanging from the branches. This was a real practice. So gathering under the blossoming cherry trees in the spring or under the autumn foliage in the fall, having a few cups of sake, eating some snacks, and engaging in poetic exchange was a regular elite practice in the medieval period that became increasingly popular and extended to urban commoner populations in the Tokugawa period. And again, key to this, this particular way of capturing the social exchange of poems is recording them on these tanzaku and hanging them from the branches. And Paul mentioned to me earlier that we can trace the existence of these poem slips that have perforations that show that they were hung in this fashion back to the Muromachi period. So again, my emphasis here is on the profoundly and fundamentally social nature of poetic exchange and of the act of calligraphy that records poems onto paper. Let me turn now to the most voluminous form that we see in this exhibition, and in fact, a kind of technology for the presentation and preservation of calligraphy and paintings in Japanese culture that is so ubiquitous that we almost don't even think about it. And that is the hanging scroll. I think most often referred to as kakejiku in Japanese, but in tea, which is sort of the world that I come from, often referred to using the word kakemono. There are lots of things to talk about when we talk about hanging scrolls, and I don't have the time to go into all the detail, and to be honest, I don't have the expertise to dig as deep as one could. I'll just say that the hanging scroll represents a technology that was developed in China, at least was absolutely fully formed by the Tang Dynasty. It probably was used before then. It may have originated in the practice of hanging textile banners as part of the process of Buddhist propagation, and that over time phrases, teachings were included on those banners, and this evolved over the decades or centuries into the practice of actually mounting works of paper on scrolls. I think everybody knows this, but I'll just state the obvious that there are dowels on the top and bottom of a scroll that allow the scroll to be rolled up. This means that a big work of calligraphy or painting can be made small and can be transported easily, can be stored in a wooden box, can be protected from the elements, and can be passed down over the generations in a temple, in a family, in a storehouse, and is one of the most remarkable technological inventions in all of East Asian history. Scrolls are also interesting, like frames for European-style paintings, in the ways that they demarcate what should be looked at. And sometimes there are very elaborate and beautiful textiles that are used to create a border around the paper in the center of the scroll. Those need to be swapped out sometimes over time, and you'll notice, of course, in this exhibition, some of our scrolls need to be remounted. They need to be given a new updated form. But the original paper, the rectangular shikishi or the long, narrow poem slip is prominently displayed at the center of the scroll. There are many different kinds of scrolls, and I want to introduce you to just a couple of important examples, I think, for understanding this show. One is the style of calligraphy known as bokuseki, which literally means ink traces, and which is closely associated with Zen or Chan Buddhism. This is a famous example from the Tokugawa Art Museum that was once owned by Tokugawa Ieyasu. There's a really wonderful history of collecting and displaying bokuseki in Japan. The Ashikaga shoguns, the military rulers of the medieval Muromachi period, collected Chinese art and purchased art that had been imported to Japan through the Red Seal trade with Ming Dynasty China via the port city of Sakai. They amassed an incredible collection of Chinese paintings, Chinese calligraphy, Chinese ceramics that formed the early kind of starting point for the culture of tea, the culture of cha-no-yu. So bokuseki, although they come from a particular religious tradition, also became central to the origins of Japan's distinctive culture of tea, what we often call the tea ceremony. We have examples of bokuseki written in Japan as well. This is an example by the famous Japanese Zen monk and abbot Ikkyu Sojun, who not only played a key role in the history of Zen institutions in Japan, but is also a major figure in the history of tea culture. Another type of calligraphy that we often find mounted as a hanging scroll is the letter. And I actually recently collaborated with two historians in Japan to publish a book of letters from the 16th and 17th centuries that we transcribe and translate and analyze in 23 chapters. And each of those letters exists today mounted as a hanging scroll. So again, we take this for granted, we don't even think about it, but what this represents is a very deliberate attempt by an institution or a family to preserve a piece of writing that was penned usually by someone famous or important or influential in a format so that it can be displayed. Because one of the most important aspects of the history of the hanging scroll is that it allows a piece of writing or a painting to be put in the tokonoma, which we heard about earlier today, the decorative alcove that is found in the palaces of the Ashikaga shoguns, the tea rooms of the tea practitioners of pre-modern Japan, and eventually even in the homes of many residents of the Japanese archipelago, and can be swapped out quite easily because this technology is so portable and so adaptable. So you hang your hanging scroll for spring, you swap it out for summer, or maybe you swap it out every single time you have guests, if you have a big enough collection of scrolls like some people in this room. It's a way of signaling that you are communicating non-verbally to your guests. So for example, if I ever hosted Paul Berry, one of our distinguished speakers, for a tea gathering or a banquet at my home, I would hang a hanging scroll by an artist from Kyoto, because Paul lives in Kyoto. And I wouldn't say that to him, and he wouldn't say it to anyone else, but we would both know that I was communicating something to him, something personal, something almost intimate, through the selection of a scroll to hang on the wall in the decorative alcove for our gathering. So letters are very convenient to be mounted as hanging scrolls. They're often cut, so you don't always get the whole letter. And historians use these documents sometimes without thinking about why they were mounted as hanging scrolls. Why this text and not another text? There's always an editing process, a selection process here that I think has to be interrogated. Another type of hanging scroll is the writing or painting of literati and eccentrics of the type that we just heard about from Pat. These really interesting residents of Kyoto in the 18th and 19th centuries, and you have similar eccentric traditions in other parts of Japan as well. This is a particularly funny image. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail about it. It's a parody. It shows a demon who is engaged in falconry and it's based on a poem by the important artist Sakai Hoitsu. My point here is simply to say that one of the things that people valued in commissioning or buying a hanging scroll was the eccentric personality of the maker captured in a form that can be displayed again and again and again. And the idea in Japanese culture that, I can't remember who today said this, I think it was Ray, that the breath of the calligrapher, or in a sense the spirit of the maker, is somehow imbued in the scroll and can be brought into a gathering, also means that these objects are often deployed at Buddhist memorial ceremonies. If you have a tea gathering to mark the 100-year anniversary of the death of one of your ancestors or the teacher of your teacher, you often will have a hanging scroll of their writing or of a painting or a bokuseki that they loved. So there's this sense of a hanging scroll as a kind of vehicle for the delivery of the personality and aesthetic preferences of someone who is no longer with us that makes these very powerful. The last type of writing that we find often on hanging scrolls that I want to mention that returns us to Rengetsu is kana. The phonetic writing system that is associated with the women writers of the Heian period and later periods in pre-modern Japanese history, but that actually was not necessarily limited by gender, but was a way of representing vernacular language or lived experience or even emotions for both male and female writers that differentiated it from Chinese writing. There is a long tradition of writing calligraphy on these rectangular sheets of paper that are called shikishi that were of various sizes in the Heian period, as in the case of this example attributed to Fujiwara no Kinto. But over time, that became increasingly standardized and were actually almost mass-produced. Today, if you go to Japan, you almost are guaranteed to be given between 1 and 20 shikishi, so this exact size of paper, usually on a kind of cheap cardboard stock with somebody's calligraphy on it. I taught English for some time in Japan, and everyone who I taught English inevitably at some point gave me their calligraphy on one of these sort of boards. But these could also be mounted on hanging scrolls. And I think for Rengetsu, who was herself from a samurai lineage and then was adopted into a family that also had once had samurai lineage, her engagement with waka poetry, her engagement with the particular style of calligraphy that she innovated in and was so creative in, as Paul explained and as Melissa elucidated so beautifully this morning, I think was an attempt to connect to a kind of lost aristocratic past. And for her to elevate the fortunes of her adopted family in particular, one of the reasons she was adopted was so that she could help bring fortune back to this family that had fallen on hard times. That was not successful. Of course, her first marriage ended in divorce. Her second marriage, which was successful, ended with the early death of her husband and the tragic death of her daughter. So she didn't continue the family business, which in a way was the intention, but she did reestablish her membership in a community of practice extending back to these aristocratic traditions of the Heian, Kamakura, and Muromachi eras, which is really, I think, very much about her training, her education, but also her creativity as an artist. This is just an example of the kind of space in which a hanging scroll can be displayed. It sort of sets the tone for the room. It gives a seasonal cue. Sometimes it's paired with a seasonal flower arrangement. And for warrior banquets, for poetry salons, for tea gatherings, for all different kinds of social encounters, the hanging scroll was almost like the menu. So again, my point, this is an inherently social object. Okay, turning now to the last form that we see, of course, in this exhibition, I want to talk briefly about the ceramics that are made by Rengetsu. We've heard a lot about those ceramics already, and although I'm a historian of ceramics by training, I think the wonderful analysis we've heard of Rengetsu ceramics today is far more interesting than anything I could tell you. So what I want to focus on instead is the genealogy of handmade amateur ceramics that I think influenced Rengetsu. And that is, serendipitously, an area about which I have a little bit more knowledge. The practice of amateurs making ceramics by hand, not using a potter's wheel, comes from the raku tradition. That was my first research project many decades ago when I first met actually all three of my fellow speakers. The raku tradition originated in Kyoto in the late 16th century. It seems to have begun as the work of a heterogeneous group of potters, some of whom may have been migrants from the Fujian region in China and were engaged in roof tile production for the warlords who were building palaces and castles in and around Kyoto. And they set up these small kilns in Kyoto that could produce experimental works in collaboration with tea practitioners. And in the 17th century, the kind of experimental nature of these small raku kilns meant that there was an openness to non-professionals, amateur tea practitioners coming to the raku potters and saying, can I get clay from you? Can I get some instruction from you? I'll make my own quirky wares, and then I'll bring them back to you to be glazed and fired. Or in some cases, the amateurs glaze them themselves. So the most famous amateur raku potter in all of Japanese history is the artist Honnami Koetsu, who was a brilliant, eccentric urban commoner who lived in Kyoto and who was from a family of sword polishers, but also was one of the most brilliant calligraphers of the 17th century. He collaborated with lacquer makers, with painters. He was a tea practitioner, and he made these funky, eccentric pots that no professional potter would ever make. They were neither symmetrical nor asymmetrical. They didn't show any of the technical brilliance that the professional raku potters usually displayed, and they were glazed in very haphazard ways. But the very eccentricity of the pots is precisely what gave them meaning. He gave them to his friends as gifts. He may have sold some of them in some cases, although we have no records of those transactions. But they came to be valued by later generations of tea practitioners as material embodiments of his sense of taste, his sort of aesthetic vision. You could hold a pot by Honnami Koetsu in your hand, and you were holding a kind of didactic lesson from Koetsu in artistic value. And this proved to be incredibly popular. This pot is so hard to explain, but I'll try. So it's a lumpy, ugly ceramic that was seemingly made by a rank amateur. But in fact, this tea bowl was made by one of the most skilled potters ever to touch the medium of raku ceramics, Raku Ryonyu, who lived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, who technically could make things no one else in his tradition had ever made. But he deliberately made this pot as a respectful copy, an utsushi, of a pot by an amateur potter named Kakukakusai Sosa, who was himself the head of the Omotesenke tea school in the prior generation, a school that was the most important customer of the raku kiln. So there's this kind of dense, intertwined network of economic relationships, but also social relations, friendships, family relationships, all tied up in the production of this really lumpy-looking piece. And I think it's a wonderful example of how these pinch, pot or hand-carved pot exchanges, like the poem slips, like the hanging scrolls, are fundamentally social works that are almost always made as gifts or as a respectful celebration of the work of someone in the past. Again, this idea of these communities of practice is key to the point I'm trying to make here. All right, so to return to these two artworks from the exhibition, my intention here is to outline some of the ways in which calligraphy has a materiality and a material function that I think is really important to pay attention to. And that when we understand how these objects function in social networks, in particular social contexts, we can have an even greater appreciation for their meaning. And we can maybe understand not only why they were made in such large quantities, but why they were sought out, right? What the source of the demand was for the beautiful but quirky lines of Rengetsu's calligraphy and original poems, for the bold, in some ways occasionally almost kind of violent brushstrokes of Nantenbō's calligraphy and paintings. These were disseminated throughout communities of practice and played important roles to those who owned them and displayed them in tea gatherings and other moments of sociability, because it allowed those who had access to these objects to claim shared membership in a community of practice with the artist. Thank you.